initiative now for almost 4 years, which is crazy to think, but it was an intentional focus for us to really make sure that we were integrating career goals and outcomes into all of our programs and initiatives with sending students abroad. And that seems super obvious, but the reality is that we were doing it to varying degrees. And I think that one of the things that's been exciting and rich about this whole project is to really take that step back and be looking at how that actually plays out in terms of program design. I'm kind of obsessed about program design because I am a firm believer that programs are, and locations and durations are never inherently better or worse. It's all down to the design of the program fostering a specific outcome. And so for us to really take that harder look at it has been a big focus of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've integrated this into my global seminar, which I think in some ways is a good test case because when we talk about careers and education abroad, people immediately, of course, bring up internships, and they bring up the things that are in some ways rather obvious, in my opinion. And I think one of the things that, even when we hosted our first career integration conference, I was blown away by was that we didn't get a single proposal about integrating it into short-term programs. So, if 35% of our students at this university are going abroad on instructor-led programs and we don't know how to integrate that into that model, we have a really big problem because we're telling all of these students that they should be going abroad, that will have some benefit for their careers, right? But we aren't really interrogating what that looks like and what it means in terms of program design. And previous to my taking that step back, I wasn't doing it either. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my class and how, when I challenged myself to do this, what that looked like. So in some ways, my class is a great test case for something where this is not at all obvious, frankly. I teach a class called Inventing Ireland, the creation of Irish identity through drama, film, and performance. So it's an arts and literature-based class. I inevitably have students from every college. Every time I've taught, I think I've had at least 80% of the colleges on campus, many of whom have not read plays. You know, last time I had quite a few English and theater majors, which was nice, but that's not been often the makeup of it. So I'm structuring a course that works for English majors and people who have not been to the theater, which is a really interesting and I think rewarding challenge, but it makes for some interesting dynamics in the group. I get a lot of first-timers. I get, let's see, last time I had 22 students and only 4 had been out of the US before, and every time I've taught I've had someone who's not been on a plane before. So in terms of my ability to have an impact in their worldview and their life, it's really exciting, and it's one of the reasons why I love teaching, and I love teaching in Ireland, because most of the students are choosing it because it's Ireland. And there's something, they don't even know why they want to go to Ireland, and it's somewhere that resonates with people, but I get that because I studied abroad my first time in Ireland, cried the whole flight there, and thought it was the biggest mistake I'd ever made, and it seems to have worked out pretty well. But so I think, you know, for me, this is, it's always been this thing where I'm teaching content that I love, but I'm teaching in a place where I'm also teaching the culture, and I'm teaching, you know, a journey of how you interact with the culture, even if you haven't had these experiences before. So that does mean that I probably put a lot of cultural focus into what I'm teaching, and again, because my content is about the relationship between arts, perceptions of identity, cultural identities, projects to create a cultural identity, for those of you not familiar with Ireland, because it was colonized by the Brits for a very long time. At the turn of the century, the last century, it had been decimated in terms of culture, language, education, things like that, and a group of writers and actors and practitioners arguably saved Irish culture through the establishment of the Abbey Theatre, which led to nationalisms, and it's all very drawn together. But it's an amazing test case of the role of arts and literature in actually creating culture, not just preserving it, creating it, because it was lost. And then you end with the commodification of culture, which the business students particularly like, because one of my arguments is that Irish culture is the best branded culture, arguably on the planet. You can't go anywhere and not find an Irish pub, or t-shirts, or things like that. People want to be Irish, I don't know why. There's a brand behind the culture that's very powerful. So that's an interesting thing to interrogate when you end with things like river dance, which are just crazy and have nothing to do with Irish dancing, but are sure popular. So I think to talk about this holistically, it works well for all these things. So I'm going to pass around, I have a very similar values exercise that I do within the first day or so on site, and one of the things that we do with this is that it's often done, the version that Angie's doing, is a bit more in terms of individually how people approach these different things in terms of value and identity. We talk about this from a cultural perspective. So I use this as a lens to discuss what is different. Ireland's a tricky culture because it's so friendly and it seems quite familiar. It's easy for students to miss the very many ways that it's culturally absolutely different than American culture. So we talk a lot. We go through that list and students talk about it from a personal perspective. But then I have them talk about what they think American culture, where American culture is on this. So for instance, equality versus hierarchy. Ireland is a very hierarchical society. The assumption that you have the ability to be upwardly mobile is not particularly Irish, particularly given its history. And so to get students thinking about how these things that are going on under the surface of a culture play out both on a cultural level and for individuals within that culture, and then be thinking about themselves as an individual and themselves within American culture, is a good way to be getting them thinking about what we're studying in a broader context. So these are things that I was already doing, and when I taught the first time, one of my great concerns as someone who works in education abroad is, first of all, reentry. This is something we struggle with, and I really wanted to make sure that I was fostering something on site about reentry before students came back. And one of the things that is a focus of the class is the idea of how students are going to represent Ireland going forward. It is a culture mired in stereotypes, many of them not particularly positive. So for instance, I do a photo scavenger hunt, and I talk a lot with students about the responsibility you take on when you take images of another culture and put them out there. And really challenge them, are they going to propagate the same stereotypes that everyone already has about the Irish now that they know the country and have a familiarity and hopefully an affection for it? Is it just going to be the drinking photos? Is it just going to be, you know, those photos that are these cliche images, or are they going to look for different ways to represent Ireland? So we've already had that conversation within the class. And so from the first time I taught it, the thing that I had them do on the last day as a re-entry exercise was to challenge them to think beyond the it was great when people ask how their program was. We all know this problem. Students come back, people say, how's Ireland? And they say, oh, it was amazing. And they don't know how to talk about it past that. So I threw in that when Ireland, the first thing that other students were likely to ask them, having studied abroad them myself, was, oh my God, did you totally drink? Was the pubs, must have been so much fun. And that is the piece of Irish culture that everyone will ask you about and gravitate towards. So I came up with an exercise where I asked them all to, in response to how was your program, come up with 3 statements about Ireland that were more concrete, that maybe addressed something that they were surprised by, a fact that they found interesting, so that they were ready when that question came up to have the tools to have a slightly more meaningful conversation about Ireland. And that went really, really well, and the students really liked the ability to write that down, share, and reflect on it while they were all still in Ireland. So that, again, that was something I was doing. So last time when I was teaching, and when I'd gone back and really thought more about this career integration piece, what I did was, as you'll see from this exercise handout, is that after we did the re-entry, the 3 facts for your friends and family about Ireland exercise, and the great thing is again, because they're all sharing their answers, people are like, oh, that's good, yeah. You know, they're getting from each other good answers, and so it really feeds into populating what your toolkit of things about this experience that's useful. Then I asked them to all come up with 3 statements about this experience that they could potentially use in a job interview or a graduate school interview, or something to highlight that experience when the stakes are just that little bit higher. Now, to your point, at first they kind of struggled with what that could look like. So then what I did was I shared with them the list of the top 10 skills that employers want. And I said, read this list. and now answer, based on this list, if there's anything here that you feel was enhanced from this experience. You know, so the joke was, I said, did anyone learn anything about teamwork over the last 3 weeks? Traveling with these people you've never met before and sharing spaces with them? And everyone went, oh, and started writing furiously. And so I think this is, was a great exercise, so simple. It really took 40 minutes to do those 2 questions. But I like to think it got them thinking in a really specific way. Because again, if Carlson is requiring students to go abroad and some of them are choosing my class in Ireland, if they can't see how that would be useful in a job interview, that's a problem. And it was really fun to talk to them after and have them say, yeah, I get that now. I hadn't thought of it that way, but, and of course they say things like, I didn't actually choose this class because I was interested in theater. What? But I think they're kind of surprised themselves at how much that they've learned from the experience. And so again, I just share this as a really simple exercise that I think could be put into any content, any location, any sort of curricular area, and help them both with that reentry piece and then considering how that might come up in a job interview. Then the last thing is a little bit similar to Angie's, although don't take the time to meet with them all for 30 minutes. But when I give them their final grades, one of the things I've challenged myself to do is to point out to them something about themselves that perhaps they didn't know, that might have career or leadership or implications. So along with their grade and a final comment on their final paper, I will write, by the way, I noticed that you were the person that everyone always went to organize dinner. Do you know that's leadership? Or I noticed that you were the person who never got nervous about getting on public transportation and traveling around, and you were really good at navigating. That's a skill. You were the person who always made sure that everyone was included. That was a skill. So I really tried to, along with the grade for the literature and the papers and all that, to point out something to them, because I do think one of the things that any of you who have led groups, things emerge when they're abroad that they have never had to do before. And it's interesting. I know that I've read a lot of some of the research that's coming out about language of deficit. And one of the things that we find when students go abroad is that sometimes the students who come from more diverse backgrounds actually are the best when they get abroad, because they've had to navigate in circumstances that are different from their home life or from mainstream culture in a different way. So suddenly they're often the ones on site who are much more adaptable, and you really see that rise. And it's fun to be able to say to them, wasn't it great to be somewhere where the fact that you were not at all nervous about doing X, Y, and Z was such a benefit to the other students. So I do think that it's a space where often students who don't perceive themselves as leaders back here really rise in those occasions. And so, again, a simple thing for me to do as an instructor to just point out those things that I see them doing. I always like to use the example of one of the students in my first program who maybe was not the most intellectually engaged student, but super generous and a big heart. And Stephanie, every single time we'd have a speaker in, and I talked to them a lot about, these are my friends, these are my contacts, be active listeners, we're great, 30% of the grade is participation, and I need you to be on all the time. And partly because of just who she was the person who every single speaker asked a question, especially if there were like those crickets and no one was asking a question, and you're going, oh, please, someone. And bless her, she would raise her hand. Sometimes I don't even think she knew what she was asking, but she would always ask a question. And she was great about including people. And so when I did her grade, I wrote a big thing that she was the only one who got the full points on participation, because she just brought something to that, which was so lovely. So she ended up coming back to me after and doing our London internship program the next summer. And I suggested she maybe look into HR things, because she was a CLA communications, but she did a placement in London in HR. And she now is a recruiter. She was at Target. She didn't get laid off. She was so good she didn't get laid off last year, but she's now moved to another company, which she chose because it's an international company. And you know, I think it's wonderful that you have this opportunity to say to someone, you are doing something that you don't even know you are doing differently than the other students, because that little nugget might be the thing that leads them down a road that they hadn't thought of. And that's all.
People have questions?
Just a sort of mundane question, really. So with the top 10 skills employer wants, did you say to the students, you know, can you address one of these, or all of them, or as many as you can? How did you
I didn't say, I said let's look through that list and maybe take a step back and consider what activities or things that we did on this, and if there's any way you can integrate any of these into those three comments. And I told them, you know, again, that it's up to them. Employers are also going to say, big deal, you took a 3-week-long, you know, film class in Ireland. That's not going to help me in Target Corporation. So they have to say, and I want to point out that I did this program in Ireland, and one of the things that was interesting was that I was with students from around the university that I never would have met otherwise, with really different backgrounds, and I really learned a lot about what it's like to work with people from diverse backgrounds, that, you know, you have to almost proactively assume the person doesn't value it and point out to them what that skill is based on this list.
Yeah. And did that take the form of like a little response paper type thing, which they handed in, or was it part of it?
They shared it, and again, which was nice was when they shared both of those, their 3 answers with everyone else got little nuggets of good answers that other people had thought of that they hadn't, and so the students were taking notes like crazy during that and really enjoyed that.
You mean they shared it in a verbal way?
Yep. We all went around and everyone shared their 3 answers. And some of them were funny. You know, it was a very relaxed, and to the point that was made earlier, I do have them on the first day make that, that honor contract that establishes sort of, and I've been very fortunate in that my students have been super supportive and really enjoyed sharing with each other. But, you know, I do say from the get-go, the great news is you're going to hear everyone else's answers, and so feel free to steal liberally because there's no right answer, and if someone else came up with something that didn't occur to you, that's great.
I was going to say, with our freshman seminars, we often encourage the assistant program leaders to do the 3 things activity that you talked about. So they do that in different forms, whether they kind of prime them on the way home or whether they take part of the last meal together and share them or talk about them in the reentry workshop. But I think this would be a nice add for having either a lot of our program leaders or the assistant program leaders help facilitate the career-focused one on top of. But I like the transition of these 3 things that you're going to do more personally, and then now let's focus, because I think that might get them there a little bit easier than jumping straight to that.
It also points out that they might not be the same answer.
Right, exactly.
You know, because if they're giving the same answers to friends and family,
right,
they haven't
that's
thought
not
about
the
what
one
you're
they
going to
might
tell an employer.
Right.
Might be a very different answer. You know, it's not about what you got out of it, it's about how that's
right.
going to help your
right.
employer.
Right.
For that sort of personal feedback at the end of the semester, I mean, yes, because I was just thinking about that, because I know I often have difficulty in getting to that point with classes generally. I mean, they're just out of there, and you know, and it's hard to track them down. So I'm just wondering, again, just very sort of in a mundane way, just the logistics of that. How were you able to do that? Did you collect the papers sort of prior to the last class and then hand them back to them with the
Their final papers?
Yeah, and then with those
No,
comments
I give them a week after return to turn in their final paper, and then I red mark it. I give them the opportunity of picking that up if they want, but for most of them, I send them, here was what you got for participation. They've all known their grades for everything else throughout, and here's what you got on your paper, so here's your final paper. And then in that email is when I write a paragraph that is personal.
Does anyone ever write you back?
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of them do. And of course, then you get to do all the references for them for many, many years. But I've had 2 that applied to medical school and asked me to be one of their 2 references because I know them in such a different way than any of their professors here, and they both got in. And so, you know, it is interesting how much they value that they feel like this highlighted a different skill set than they're getting in the biology classes. So, you know, it is interesting how many of them resonate that I've gotten to know them in a different way. And